there's a lot of sort of discourse around that time as of the countryside being almost like outside of the state, like there's an absent state in the Mongolian countryside. But in my experience, I thought, okay, this is not really what's happening, because I see a lot of local administrators doing home visits to herders all the time. I see a lot of local government administration, but a lot of writers would present it as if, there's no government in rural Mongolia, therefore we need to do all these interventions. And then, kind of interventions according to this like Western logic of what that should look like. I kind of started to get involved in looking more at how mining was affecting the kind of relationships between herders and mining, and these types of land use which were often happening in the same areas, often around important water sources. Because there's this interesting geological dynamic where a lot of the precious minerals are in these fault lines where then water and the minerals happen kind of at the same time. Although I'm not a geologist, but from speaking to some of my geologist friends, I came to understand that there's like this interesting relationship between some of the resources that were very important to pastoralists, like water in Mongolia, which is quite an arid place, and then like copper, gold, coal. Those are some of the major items that are exported. Then I got involved as sort of an independent researcher in this complaint. There's a big complaint against the Oyuntulgoy mega mine in the South Gobi. Herders lodged complaints against the mine through this IFC complaint mechanism. And the complaint was lodged in 2012, and I got involved in 2016 when they were looking for independent researchers to kind of understand dynamics. And so and that's when I really got involved in looking at mining. And ever since then, I've been kind of exploring these issues around resettlement and local impacts, the types of companies. Because in Mongolia right now, there's over 2,000 companies, large and small, across the country. We often think about the bigger ones, but many companies, which are Mongolian private companies, Korean joint ventures, Chinese, doing all sorts of mining. Some of them is just like a bulldozer, bulldozer out in an area and doing a gold operation. Others might be quite a bit bigger. So you see a huge diversity of mining. And what's interesting about the informal mining is that often, in some cases, informal mining might be a way to kind of claim the territory, although I don't think it's been very successful, unfortunately, in Mongolia. But there's a lot of kind of conflict between people doing informal mining and then larger mines that want to, have a formal license over those lands to then do a larger extraction project. And also, it's interesting, like in other places in the world, you see a lot of informal mining on the tailings. So that's the material that's like removed and dumped. So they go over the tailings and try to find whatever is sort of left over. So it's almost like the mining, the large scale mining and the informal mining can sometimes go together. And there's a lot of like health and safety issues related to that in some cases. And it's interesting because there's a few different ways that informal mining has been presented in Mongolia, and a lot of different policies related to that have changed over the years. So herders themselves that I know I've talked to in this province called Bayanhunger, there's almost like a season where they may go kind of make some extra money. And it's not that they're giving up herding. It's not like they're saying, I'm transitioning out of this livelihood into a new one, but they're kind of doing it in an opportunistic way. And there may be a whole range of reasons for that. It might be because of loss of livestock because of a major zud, which is this winter disaster. But it might be also, to meet monetary needs to pay school fees or to healthcare or whatever it might be. So it's kind of a way that can be combined with herding livelihoods. So just to kind of emphasize that it's not necessarily people exiting one livelihood into another, but it's kind of like a combined with other things. And there's also quite a lot of taboos around informal mining because kind of cosmologically, Mongolians don't really support digging into the ground, that type of activity. So there's a lot of worry around like the spiritual repercussions of informal mining, that potentially attracting, bad things, bad spirits. bad consequences or even health consequences. So there's a lot of concern around, benefiting from that type of wealth might have potential effects on family that people do really worry about. So there is sort of this taboo around people saying, that I am an informal miner. They don't necessarily want to identify as that being their main livelihood. So often it's like they're a herder, but they may do some informal mining on the side. But interestingly, there's been a big push in the Mongolia policy space through a project led by the Swiss Development Agency to formalize informal mining. It sounds strange, because they were quite concerned about some of the health and safety risks, like use of different chemicals. A lot of people have broken bones or fallen into some quite deep pits. So, and then that's quite devastating for a family. So there's a lot of health and safety things. And through formalizing this and getting people who participate in this livelihood to then pay taxes to the state, this process created like this form of employment, which was then seen as almost like valid in the eyes of the state, if that makes sense. So there's a big push of the state collaborating with development organizations like the Swiss Development Agency to support artisanal mining. So they then present it as an artisanal mining sector, which then benefits the government, et cetera. But then it was interesting because actually one of my master's students did a project on this and found that a lot of people didn't want to necessarily formalize their work as these miners because they still had quite a strong identity as herders, and there are a lot of taboos around mining. So he found that a lot of people, it's part of the formalization project was like wearing these colorful uniforms and, paying taxes and doing lots of paperwork and having all sorts of safety signs and stuff. So it's just like kind of not many people moved into that as a formal sector, but many people are. So you can kind of see this diversity now of people who have really embraced that, maybe some herders who have fully left herding into that, or people from urban areas that have started to kind of take on this employment as artisanal miners. So you have like artisanal miners, formalized, paying government taxes. Then you have sort of like the informal people who might do it, here and there. And then you may have people that may be actually in quite a devastating economic situation that they may have no other means, and so they turn to that. And it's difficult too when it comes to land rights, because what I've found with the work that we're doing on large scale mining is that there's an acceptance of herders' sort of customary use of land, which is quite flexible, kind of adhering to this more non-equilibrium understanding of how land is used. In the Gobi, where there's very little rainfall, people need to travel to new locations to access water, to access pasture, and that's a very flexible use of land. But often people go back to places they know, so it's not like a random. They're not like randomly deciding, unlike the nomadic random wanderer. They're making strategic choices based on their expertise. So within that, there's an understanding, acceptance of that type of land use. But now that there's more and more demand for mining, and that's seen as like a pathway to development for the economic, for the country, then weirdly enough, a lot of the sort of ways that herders use land, it isn't formally protected in the law. So it's very easy for the state to appropriate land, because basically all the land, like in the picture behind me, is like this land is all kind of state-owned public land. And without mining, it's used by herders in their traditional way. That's widely accepted. But then now that there's so much demand for mineral extraction, they're appropriating so much land. And because herders are not accepted as indigenous people in Mongolia, then they don't have the same kind of rights for free, prior, informed consent that they would if they were considered to be, an indigenous population in the country. So that's also a big issue. And so what we've observed with our work is a lot of forced resettlement, a lot of almost like human rights violations around land being expropriated. And part of the problem is that there's a lens where people always think in terms of private property. So, there may be a huge amount of land that herders are using in this flexible way, but they will only think about, oh, I'm just compensating this person for where their winter camp is located, which it might be a very small place, and they'll say, okay, we will compensate you by building you a new corral like a couple kilometers away, without thinking about, oh, actually this is really changing the whole dynamic of how the land is being used. There's all these water sources which are being taken away. There's spiritual sites, there's a lot that is actually being lost. And herders don't kind of really have a right to say, actually, this 100-kilometer square space is actually part of our livelihood. So there's a lot of discrimination that I've seen around the this interaction between mining companies and herders. So it's interesting because in a place like Mongolia, also a lot of other Central Asian countries don't recognize indigenous populations. In China, they recognize like ethnic minorities, but they don't accept that there's indigenous groups. But it's different in Mongolia. In Mongolia, it's a very small population, and so because it hasn't been necessarily colonized by another group. Mongolia was part of the Qing dynasty, in the late 19th century, but then it gained independence. Part of what was considered to be, Mongolian-speaking groups are in Inner Mongolia, and Inner Mongolians within China are considered to be an ethnic minority of China. But within Mongolia, herding is seen as a type of employment. And though the cultural beliefs of herders are celebrated nationally in Mongolia as a common cultural, background, so in a way, some people are bankers and then they retire and become herders. So, so there's this issue around, okay, who is indigenous? Everyone is indigenous because they've, that's their land for centuries, thousands of years. They claim Genghis Khan as the father of their nation. But obviously there's linguistic diversity in Mongolia. There's minority populations. In the West, there's like Kazakhs. There's Buryat groups. So there's groups that are sort of seen as minority groups, but in a way, all of them are indigenous. And in that sense, the international understanding or the international legal definition of indigenous becomes quite kind of awkward in a place like Mongolia, because you want to protect this, what we would consider to be indigenous knowledge, but it's kind of in a way seen as a form of employment because that knowledge is shared. There's a lot of, all the food, heritage, cultural understandings are shared amongst people in urban areas too, and there's a lot of back and forth between those areas. So, but when you want to get legal protections for people that are practicing mobile pastoralism, then it becomes quite tricky. It's like, well, designating groups that actually work as pastoralists would allow them to have rights under international law, which now they can't quite leverage in the same way.